Next slide. Okay, first I want to welcome and thank our speakers. As you can see, there's quite a few. Next slide, please. We are going to talk about a lot of things very quickly, but the goal is that you will have a basic idea about what's happening with the Maglev. You will give you a good sense of the project and a lot of the work that's been done by people such as at MCTA on getting with the experts that are getting information by reading through the draft environmental impact statement, all hundreds of pages of it. So we want you to get a sense of that. And logistically, we want you to send your questions through chat. You can start doing it now. As you know, as you can see, there's a lot of information. We're not going to stop in between. So start sending your questions and we'll be collating them. And as it says here, if you could keep yourself on mute, but we do like when people have their faces for us to see. It really feels good that way. Next slide. I just want to give you a couple of basics. You're going to hear these terms all the way through, so we want to make sure that they are in your head a little bit. So the SCMagLev, of which we are talking this whole evening, is the superconducting magnetic levitation train. It's new technology. There's a prototype in Japan, and that is the only place it is right now. And that's the train that they're proposing we would have here in Maryland. The Maglev, which people confuse, it's the same earlier technology, the superconducting one. It has some technology that is the superconducting part of it. So this train is a different version. It's the one that was used in Germany. It's now only in Shanghai. And it's the one that you hear people saying that there's been a lot of experience on the Maglev and that we don't need to worry about anything. But the fact is, just so you understand, the superconducting Maglev is not the one that was used before, and it is a new technology that has not been well tested. The BWRR is the Baltimore-Washington Rapid Rail, and they're the private corporation that is the developer of the SCMagLev project. And the other one you're going to hear a lot is the DEIS, and that's the Draft Environmental Impact Report. That was developed by FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, and they spend quite a bit of time developing that report. It is, I don't remember how many pages, but it's very extensive. We've had it out since January. The comments are due in 11 days, and there's a lot of activity to get comments out. So at that, I'm going to pass you on to Pat.
Good evening. My name is Pat Jackman, and I live in New Carrollton in Prince George's County. I'm a founding member and treasurer for the Maryland Coalition for Responsible Transit. And as Rhonda said, we've been working on the draft environmental impact statement and in opposition for this project. Next slide. So just what is this acronym? You heard it from Rhonda. It's the SCMagLev is a high-speed ground-based passenger transportation system currently being developed and tested in Japan. Now, unlike conventional train systems, the Maglev operates by hovering above metal tracks using a levitation system powered by magnets. Okay, you heard about the private corporation, Baltimore-Washington Rapid Rail, who's a project developer for the segment of the Baltimore to Washington part at an estimated cost of $16 billion. The short-term goal is to obtain from the FRA, Federal Railroad Administration, approval for that segment. In the meantime, Maryland Department of Transportation was awarded $27 million to develop the draft environmental impact statement. And BWRR says the train will reach over 300 miles per hour. Next slide. What the SCMagLev is not, it's not designed to serve local commuters. It's not mass transit. There's only 3 stops: DC, Baltimore Washington International Airport, and South Baltimore, Cherry Hill. It's not affordable. Tickets cost $60 to $80 one way. It will not remove local commuter traffic from the roads. People have to drive to the stations, or they're going to choose to drive the whole route themselves. And this is not a green project. The construction and the train itself require high electrical consumption. So let's take a look at the Maglev route. Okay, the whole route from DC to Baltimore is approximately 40 miles. 70% of that is underground tunnel. A commuter would have to catch a train at the Mount Vernon Square station in DC and tunnel under Ward 5 till they get the Maryland line. Then the train will tunnel under the Anacostia River at Bladensburg Waterfront Park, under neighborhoods, and surface at the Greenbelt Forest Preserve. The portion that's going to be traveling through BARC, that's Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, along the BW Parkway and the Patuxent Research Refuge, would be all above ground on viaducts. Then the train tunnels back down for its one stop at the BWI Airport, remains in the tunnel till it gets to Cherry Hill, which is south of Baltimore City. Next slide. Now, I won't be reading this, but you can get an idea about the kind of construction needed for this kind of infrastructure. BWRR estimates the whole route will take 7 years. The construction in our county alone will last 45 years. Now, I'd like to introduce Louis Cerny to talk to you about crashworthiness.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. This is a photo of a maglev accident in Germany in which 23 people were killed in 2006. And my reasons for being involved in this now is to avoid having this happen here in Maryland. Statements of foreign governments certifying safety should not be relied on. This is clear from the example of the German government certifying the safety of their maglev system, but then this accident happened. Next slide. US DOT safety experts should determine safety rules called Rules of Particular Applicability, or RPAs, for the safety of the SCMagLev. These rules should be determined before a record of decision would be issued allowing construction. SCMagLev is being questioned in Japan itself. The planned 2027 date to start their first SCMagLev regular operation, other than a test track, is unlikely to be met. This could make Maryland the first place where the safety of the SCMagLev technology would be tested in regular day-to-day service. US safety standards applicable to Amtrak should not be ignored just because it is a maglev train. There are many ways the SCMagLev can crash with objects, including where it can leave the guideway, since there is no physical restraint in the guideway hardware to keep the levitated train from rising out of it. Safety rules are also needed for the guideway switches. They are extremely complex and involve moving heavy parts, including the guideway sidewalls, which support the weight of the vehicle. Next slide. US safety standards are needed for the rubber tire mode that SCMagLev will use up to 93 miles an hour in normal use and over 300 miles an hour in emergencies. Parts of the vehicles needing to be at a temperature of 450 degrees below zero is also a safety concern. SCMaglev's automated driverless system needs safety scrutiny. Perhaps most importantly, safety rules are needed due to the dangers of SCMagLev electromagnetic radiation. The DEIS shows shielding needed at passenger stations and on the vehicles. But is this sufficient, and how secure is it from leakage? To repeat, safety rules known as RPAs need to be determined by the US DOT before a final EIS is issued, which would allow construction. These safety rules could result in a decision for a no-build option. Thank you. Our next speaker is Owen Kelley.
Actually, it's Rhonda. That's okay, I think. Yes. Thank you. So I'm going to just quickly explain about the issue of jobs. One of the most attractive selling points for the SCMagLev project has been the promise of 161 to 190,000 jobs in Maryland. Unfortunately, these numbers provided by BWRR are misleading. In the draft environmental impact statement and in some private meetings, the number of jobs they advertised are clarified to be job years. And a job year is one full-time job times the years of construction, which would then be about 24,000 jobs, which is about 15% of what is advertised as jobs. Next slide, please. And the construction of the maglev is estimated to be $13.8 to $16.2 billion. The SCMagLev is a private for-profit partnership, which means that it should only be using private funding. At least that's how we might interpret it. However, according to the project website, the financing will come from a mix of sources, including federal and private funds. Japan has agreed to finance $5 billion, but that's less actually by a long shot of the actual cost, the estimated cost. So the remainder of the funding would come from US government loans and grant programs. And I did say grant, which means that the money doesn't necessarily come back to the government, and also the private sector. The taxpayers, we've already put in $28 million for the environmental impact statement, the draft one, there'll be the final one, and other activities. So we've spent money already, and money will continue to be asked for. The next slide, please. Okay. So what about in Maryland? We've talked a little federal. So under the current law, the investors could ask the state for a bailout if they do not meet their profit projections, which really has a lot to do with the ridership numbers, which you'll hear about a little later. So this is a huge list of risk, of course. And there are a lot of things that money really could be used for that would actually serve a lot more of the state and a cross section of the communities. We have experienced a lot of overruns recently. We've had the Purple Line, the Intercity County Connector, and we really can't afford, I think, not only monetarily, but emotionally to be going through that again. How about in the communities? Now that's something we don't want to lose sight of, that the people that are in the communities that the route is going through, starting in Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County, Prince George's County, and then down to a little piece of DC, there is no guarantee that people in these municipalities will actually benefit from the jobs during the construction of the daily operation. They will, however, suffer from a lot of the disturbance that would be occurring for 7 or more years of construction, and then as the train is running. And the other piece is that the train will not bring visitors or workers to the counties to support their local economies, because the train will not be stopping in their local economies. So that's all I want to talk about. And now we can actually go to Owen.
Thank you. So I'm Owen Kelley. I'm a resident of Greenbelt, and I just put in the chat a link to the article that I'll be summarizing in my slides. So the company that wants to build this, Baltimore Washington Rapid Rail, has said over and over for years that this is a green project and the maglev will reduce greenhouse gas emission. So as been said, there was a draft impact statement released in January. I combed through it. The executive summary didn't say anything about climate change impacts. I found in Appendix D4, there's a table that shows the maglev will actually increase greenhouse gas emission. That's just from operating the train. The basic idea is it takes a whole lot of electricity to send this thing traveling at 300 miles an hour, and there's emissions to generate electricity. Now, it is true that the maglev is projected to reduce miles driven on roads as some people switch to the maglev, but the impact statement says, buried in an appendix, it says that the net result will be an increase in CO2 emission. Now, journalists haven't picked up on this. There was an article recently in the Washington Post and in the Baltimore Sun where they repeated the idea that this will reduce climate emissions. And the companies that want to build this, of course, are still saying on their website that it'll reduce emissions. Next slide. So what hasn't been mentioned yet, I'm mentioning here in point number 5, is that the impact statement doesn't even try to estimate how much carbon dioxide will be released to build this in the first place. Transportation planners have ballpark figures you can use for how much concrete and steel it takes to build an underground tunnel or a mile of elevated track. And it's a well-known quantity how much carbon dioxide is emitted for these construction materials. So I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and it's hundreds of millions of kilograms of carbon dioxide that would be released to build this. There's no mention of that in the impact statement, but it's not that hard to come up with these estimates. So as I mentioned, I've written this in an article, and there's a URL for it. You can go to the next slide. And this is my cartoon diagram to explain you emit a lot to generate the electricity, you reduce a little bit because you take a few cars off the road, and there's a net increase. I'm not sure why that wasn't mentioned in the executive summary. If the Federal Railroad Administration is serving as a federal regulator, they should be presenting information in a clear and unbiased way. So that's what I have on climate. And the next speaker might be muted.
Owen.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, I'm going to talk about ridership and road congestion. The DEIS bases its ridership estimates and calculates the benefits of operating the SCMagLev over the Washington, D.C. Combined Statistical Area. That's called the CSA. However, it's misleading to use the CSA as a base for several reasons. For number one, the customers will likely come from a smaller geographic area, closer to the stations, not from the CSA as a whole. In other words, once you add in the time of the ground transportation to and from the station, the time savings start to disappear, and other existing options look more attractive. Number two, the Ridership Survey was conducted in 2018, before COVID. We all know that commuting patterns have changed a lot since the ridership study was conducted. As shown in the pie chart on the right, according to the DEIS, only 15% of the estimated ridership would be business travelers. And as Pat said earlier, these tickets are not going to be cheap. It's likely that only this small segment of the projected ridership would be able to afford the high ticket prices of the SCMagLev on a regular basis. Curious to me is 44% of the ridership would come from non-business. What does that mean? It's not defined, but we know that it's not commuters, and we know that it's not business, and it's not airport travel. The inability to unpack the assumptions behind this number, which is the largest segment, the consequences of an overestimate will have serious consequences for the economic and the commercial viability of the system. Given the size of the segment and its vagueness, one must question whether the project will be able to generate sufficient revenues to cover the costs of running and operating and maintaining the system. We should ask for a new ridership study. Second point about road congestion. The BWRR claims that the SCMagLev would be built because it would reduce road congestion, as Pat said earlier. BWRR's claims that 165 million vehicle miles of travel would be avoided each year with the SCMagLev operating between Baltimore and Washington. Traffic on Maryland's highways have increased by 1% annually pre-COVID. It's an increase of between 500 to 600 million vehicle miles annually. Even if BWRR's claim is correct, which we doubt, the impact on vehicles traveling on Maryland's highways would be overtaken well within the first year of SCMagLev operation in 2030. SCMagLev operations will likely increase transit delays around the SCMagLev stations at DC's Mount Vernon Square and at Baltimore's Cherry Hill, or Camden Yards, but it looks like Cherry Hill is the likely option, and on the DC Metro, which is already near capacity during rush hour pre-COVID. Road congestion and work zone operations will disrupt communities throughout the train route for 5 to 8 years. Operation of the SCMagLev will require maintenance vehicles using these very same roads and highways, in addition to the current level of vehicle traffic. We conclude that the proposed SCMagLev would provide little to no relief of the region's road congestion. Next, I turn this over to Sam Droege.
Thank you. So I just want to point out as a side note, as a scientist, if I write a paper and I say, I have cured cancer, I have to prove everything. Like I have to present my results. I have to show my data. It has to be verified by others. In this particular case, you're asking that the BWRR is asking you to believe that they have created these studies and figures, yet they don't want to show you any of their data. They claim propriety to that data for no reason other than what is very likely either false, weak, or inappropriate statistics. So keep that in mind as you read through these things, that these hidden things are hidden for a reason and it's not science. So now I want you to shift gears. I want you to think about the Baltimore, Washington area. So that's mostly houses, like we live there. It's mostly used up for houses and businesses. It was a large natural area, of course, at one point way back decades and decades ago. But now it's mostly used by us, and there's two kind of exceptions to this housing business model. That's Baltimore. So Baltimore is mostly houses, except you've got the harbor and you've got the Sparrows Point area, heavy industry. It's our industrial area in Maryland, and it's all private. So there may be a few government agency lands, public lands there, but basically it's private industry, and that area is completely ruined. And we need that kind of place for industry, for factories and things. Now, in between Baltimore and Washington area is a large remaining green area. It is our last protected spot for with enough capacity to retain all the plants and animals there. It also happens to be Fish and Wildlife Service refuge. It happens to be the largest agricultural research center in the entire world. It also happens to be partially owned by the National Park Service, and several other government agencies, including NASA and Goddard, all have that there, work together to maintain this large remaining green area to filter your air and provide oxygen, filter your water, and provide a place that acts as a bank for biodiversity and a place for you to enjoy and visit. Now, those are your lands. Those are public lands. Your PACS has paid for that. Now, think about this. What if we take part of Dundalk and we put it into this green area? I mean, you would be opposed to that. That is exactly the proposal. We think of the train line as the only action here, but the reality, the bigger impact is, in addition to the train line, which has a large impact of its own, we've seen some of that, is a 200-acre industrial site. 200 acre, what's that? That's 5 or is it 6 Pentagons. So Pentagon's pretty large in size. There will be not a stitch of living material left of there. It will be acres and acres of concrete and feet thick of gravel to hold and store trains. There will be a factory for building trains. There'll be washing stations, and it will be a mini Sparrows Point right there. Additionally, our biggest problem, we can move to the next slide. I'm just going to talk through this. The biggest problem, although the last slide shows you what will be gone, the biggest problem is, and it's even bigger, that is bad enough. We could stop right there and that would put an end to this entire project. The bigger problem is, if it's even approved, not just built, but approved, what's going to happen? That opens the door to any other industrialist that needs a large chunk of land and can make an argument that there's no other place to build. And in actuality, with the BWRR project, they could, if they wanted to spend a little extra money, they see this land is cheap and no one lives there, build it in several other places. But they've chosen here, once it gets documented that this is a landscape that is for sale. Remember, they're going to transfer it to a private corporation. Your land will be transferred to a private corporation as a giveaway. You will subsidize that giveaway. We heard that before. You will pay to give away your park to a private corporation so that they could ruin it. And additionally, that means that any other person can ask for that too, because why can't I put a landfill there? You gave that off to the BWRR. Landfill, just as important, and on and on. So ecologically, I think I've made most of my points. If we go to the next slide here, you have, in addition to just the general points, this is an area that's a remnant because it has all kinds of rare, barren-like habitats. It's full of super rare, some state endangered, and some federally endangered species within the area. It was the last place that the Bombus affinis was seen in Maryland, for example. I could go on. It's the most documented spot in the world, with a few other exceptions, because so many scientists have been there. There's been so much research on this area. You will be giving it to a private corporation so they could ruin that and set it as a establishment so that it will continue to be ruined after this. So think about all your visits to the area, your nice strolls through the Beltsville Ag Center, and take a look at a 150-foot long trailway and an industrial area that will be lit all night long. So I'm getting a little activated now. Let's go to the last slide. I think it might be Michael Farley's turn. No, I have one more. I think I've covered all this stuff. So let's go on to Michael, and he will activate you on other issues. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Sam. This is Michael Farley, and I am Vice President of the Beacon Heights Citizens Association. And I'll be covering community impact and environmental justice. The SCMagLev project will have a major impact on the communities residing next to the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. As you've seen, BWRR plans to run the train underground from Baltimore to BWI Airport, continuing underground through southern Anne Arundel County, above ground through Prince George's County to the outskirts of Washington, D.C., where the train will go underground again into the city. Potential property damage: the tunneled sections of the SCMagLev will be constructed using massive tunnel boring machines. The 43-foot diameter tunneled sections will be 80 to 150 feet underground, potentially as close as 35 feet below residential structural foundations. Next slide. And that is what a tunnel looks like. This one is 57 feet in diameter, but if you can imagine one 43 feet, which would only be a little smaller, and that tunnel is going to run from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, and at the least 35 feet below a residential neighborhood or a residential building. To support the tunneled sections, ventilation facilities up to 13 acres will have to be built every 3 to 4 miles along the route. Also, Maglev calls for large power substations to be built along the route. The vibration of the boring process will be transmitted into the surrounding earth. Masonry and concrete do not respond well to vibration, and they will crack. Cracks weaken foundations, and this will allow water penetration and possible mold growth. In an emergency, the emergency exits would be 3 to 4 miles apart. Passengers and emergency personnel will have to walk up to 2 miles and descend or ascend 80 to 150 feet to the surface. In case of a fire, in case of a fire in the tunnel, BWRR will have the upstream ventilation facility push air into the tunnel, where plastic, wire insulation, and lubricants will burn and release toxic compounds that cause respiratory ailments, stress human immune systems, and are potentially carcinogenic. The downstream facility will release these chemicals into the atmosphere surrounding the ventilation facility, threatening all who live nearby. As far as community impacts, there will be many. You will have impacts to the local ecosystems. They're trying to construct a tunnel in the floodplain. They will be putting in a ventilation system at the Bladensburg Waterfront Park. And there will be impacts to the recreational facilities and parklands and the cultural resources. There is no guarantee residents from local municipalities will benefit from jobs during the construction phase or the SCMaglev's daily operation. The train will not bring visitors or workers to support the local economies. Thank you. Next slide. All right, it should be environmental justice. And the minority populations comprise 69.6% of the total. Okay, thank you. Comprise 69.6% of the total population, and low income populations make up 12.7% of the SCMagLev project affected environment. And in fact, over 70% of the population is going to be Hispanic, and over 25% of this population is going to be African American. There would be both permanent and long-term, short-term impacts to the SCMagLev on the environmental justice minority populations. Construction impacts would occur at varying locations and for varying durations, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for up to 5 years. An estimated total of 460 trucks per day and 190 worker vehicles would be arriving and leaving for viaduct and electrical substation construction. Most of the frequent noise and severe vibrations occur in EJ communities. There will be a decreased level of service in residential areas, including trash collection and police access. There is no benefit for the EJ community because there will be no train stop in the environmental justice communities. Thank you very much. And I will turn this over to Suzzie Schuyler.
Thank you, Mike. I'm Suzzie Schuyler. I'm a board member, MCRT, and my background is in radiation. The adverse health effects of the exposure to the increasing amount of electromagnetic fields, or EMF, we're being exposed to are of great concern among a growing list of worldwide governmental and non-governmental public health organizations. An article from the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2020 reported the association between maternal exposure to magnetic field non-ionizing radiation during pregnancy and the risk of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in their offspring, as well as medical conditions such as dermatitis. Another recent study evaluated electromagnetic hypersensitivity, which is EHS, and that's characterized by a variety of over 60 symptoms that can vary with individuals. The symptoms were also found to be very real and to vary in severity, and can also be disabling for those that are affected. Sweden has classified EHS as a functional impairment, and Spain has classified EHS as a permanent disability. Next slide, please. EMF from mobile phones is being found to increase the risk of intracranial tumors, mostly gliomas, particularly in the case of the same side exposure. In 2019, the International Agency of Research on Cancer recommended a reassessment of the cancer risks involved with RF EMF exposure, and also recommended this research be a high priority. Next slide. EMF exposure is carefully controlled in the medical diagnostic testing, especially or specifically MRI. Patients with cardiac pacemakers, as well as implantable cardioverter defibrillators or ICDs, are cautioned about having an MRI. Current information from the Mayo Clinic and Johns Hopkins state that even with the newer model pacemakers, MRI EMF can only be 1.0 or 1.5 Tesla in strength, along with other considerations. This same criteria also applies to ICDs. Exposure to EMF can heat up the leads on the older models of pacemakers and interfere with the functioning of these devices, including altering or stopping their functioning while exposed to the EMF. Next slide. People with pacemakers and ICDs should think seriously before riding the SCMagLev train. Again, for an MRI, 1.0 or 1.5 Tesla EMF strength is the maximum. Compare this to MRI safety maximum to the 15 Tesla strength EMF needed to lift the multi-ton super SCMagLev train. Although the BWRR final alternatives report in 2018 recommends people should not be within 20 feet of the guideway, Section 4.18 of the DEIS states the limits of disturbance reaches out to 500 feet. The SCMagLev brings with it potential exposure to unwarranted and dangerous human and wildlife health levels of EMF. Long-term exposure on the health of the passengers, maintenance employees, and anyone walking, playing, or just living nearby should be assessed before the FRA approves the construction. The electromagnetic radiation generated by the SCMagLev needs to be considered as part of the increasing amounts of man-made non-ionizing radiation we are increasingly exposed to. Now I'll discuss, next slide, please, the Amtrak, which is a better alternative.
Okay.
So,
Suzzie, I'm sorry, 1 second. We're running behind, so maybe we can, some of this they'll be able to read later. So if we can move through it, I apologize, but we're already past our time to start questions.
I think we're okay, Rhonda, because I just have one question in the chat. So let's let Suzzie finish and then we can take questions.
okay. So Amtrak is a better alternative at a lower cost for the region's rail commuting future, and is to continue to upgrade and enhance the Amtrak MARC and VRE systems. So Amtrak currently provides intercity passenger rail service with over 21,000 miles of track across 46 states, including DC and Canada, and has been around for over 150 years. Amtrak's Acela Express, Northeast Regional, state-supported, and long-distance rail services between Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. provide an expansive array of services for passengers and commuters. Amtrak provides coordinated passenger and freight rail service planning for the Northeast Corridor, as well as infrastructure access and operational support to 8 commuter rail authorities, including the Maryland Area Rail Commuter, which is the MARC train, and the Virginia Railway Express, and 4 freight rail operators. Next slide. Amtrak has a long experience as the U.S. high-speed operator versus BWRR with no large complex building and no system operating experience. The Federal Railroad Administration, or FRA, has already completed a lengthy and costly evaluation of future transportation needs and consider the capacity constraints of the total transportation system, including rail, highway, and air, to complete a programmatic environmental impact study of the Northeast Corridor future proposals and plans. And Amtrak received FRA's approval. The FRA accepted and approved Amtrak's environmental impact statement and their Northeast Corridor future plan. During this long and costly study, building an additional rail alignment was considered but found to be too expensive and not needed when the plans for the existing system upgrades and enhancements were considered. Next slide. Amtrak's future is to renew and modernize the Northeast Corridor infrastructure between DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston. And that was approved by the FRA, and the updates and enhancements are in process. And you can see it by this picture here. This was as part of the $2.5 billion loan, $4.7 billion was expended to replace the Baltimore-Washington Airport rail station. Here you can see used by both Amtrak and MARC. Continuous high-speed rail has already been installed. Next slide, please. Over the next 5 to 10 years, the cost for upgrades to Amtrak will require substantial financial commitment from the federal government, Amtrak, and others. These commitments are in direct competition with the plans of BWRR and their proposed SCMagLev. If the Maglev is built, we will likely be subsidizing two competing systems. The January 2021 DEIS ignores the requirement for SCMagLev to compare and contrast itself with Amtrak services. This appears to acknowledge that Amtrak is already providing passenger and commuter transportation and improving their array of services, as well as the Northeast Corridor rail transportation facilities, equipment, and systems. Next slide, please. And as a result, we get all the pain and none of the gain. The SCMagLev has only 3 passenger terminals, DC, BWI, and Baltimore. So there's no way for Prince George's County residents to ride the SCMagLev as local transit, as it plows under and flies through the county. PG County and Anne Arundel County will be burdened with all the construction and operations pains. Financing remains obscure, and in the case of failure or bankruptcy, there are no obvious solutions for how to recommission or decommission SCMaglev's ubiquitous, toxic, and exotic non-standard proprietary facilities, nor binding obligations to restore or make our communities whole. Next slide, please. Excuse me. And as a result, a faster trip is not a quicker trip. From our country and world's experience, many high-speed and maglev train projects across the world were approved with similar promises that the Northeast Maglev is making here. Many never fulfilled their promises and required increasing amounts of government subsidies and took far longer to build. Many were shut down after significant tax dollars were expended. SCMagLev claims it will enable a 15-minute trip between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, but the proposed SCMagLev route alternatives do not directly connect with existing Northeast Corridor train terminals. So realistically, an SCMagLev trip must add ground transportation time and walking time for passengers to actually get to and from the SCMagLev station in D.C. and Baltimore, whereas existing Northeast Corridors ever faster trains and commuter services such as Amtrak, Acela, and MARC have stations in the heart of both cities and already stop at BWI Airport. It is on these existing transportation systems the vast majority commute and travel will continue to do so. It is on these commerce systems the financial blood of Maryland travels. So don't be railroaded by SCMaglev's claims and promises. So now I'll turn this back to Pat.
Thank you, Suzzie. I think because of time, we're just going to skip over this real fast because you're all going to receive a copy of this PowerPoint. But you heard, here are the basics. Safety and crashworthiness of the train system are in question. The rules of particular applicability are non-existent. The SCMagLev is not green. As a matter of fact, it can use up to 5 times the energy of a regular steel wheel train. The maglev will be extremely destructive to our waterways and environment. You heard about the Patuxent Research Refuge and the Beltsville Agricultural Center, the impacts to them. Next. Okay. The potential impact on communities is huge. You heard about the high percentage of environmental justice or minority communities that have the loss of property value, risks of exposure, and then the ongoing pollution to our waterways and so on. Next. Okay. BWR's claims of jobs and cost levels will not be realized. We don't expect the jobs that are estimated, and most likely there will be cost overruns. So who's going to wind up paying for that? Maryland taxpayers. A far better alternative is our already existing Northeast Corridor, Amtrak, MARC, and these are affordable commuter trains. Okay, next slide. As we told you before, Maryland Coalition for Responsible Transit has been working hard on analyzing the DEIS, and this is just a list of the categories that we've been working on. If you go to the link on the bottom here, the opposition points, it's a navigational document, and you can go to each one of these topics and see all the research and the points that we have identified as concerns with this project. Okay, now we'll turn it over. Oh, here are the links available to you to find the resources. And if you need information or assistance with any kind of comment letters, you can get in touch with us at the address below. And Rhonda, turn it over to you.
Yes, just a final couple notes here. If you heard something in here that piqued your interest and you want to find out more, or that made you anxious or whatever it might be, if you're concerned or you have questions, this is their opportunity over the next few days to respond with your comments to the draft environmental impact stations. You can write your concerns or questions, or if you have opposition, you put it in for the record, email, letter, or web form. And this very straightforward if you go to the website. The most important thing is that you do not need to write complicated comments in response to what you think or care about. You can go on to the website and get the information from the MCRT like we've talked about. You can look back at the slideshow here, and some other information we'll send you. You can do any of that, but you can also just write a comment that says, I am concerned about the Patuxent National Wildlife Refuge. I go there and I'm worried that this is going to be a problem. That's a comment. Or you can say that that I'm worried about how the people that live in these communities are going to be able to get from Prince George's County to Montgomery County, because there's going to be a lot of disturbance in the bus system. Whatever it might be, you just speak to from what you care about, or you go in and look at some more detailed comments. So we're just encouraging you to comment if you feel like it, if this is something that is interesting to you. The next slide, please. So I just wanted to also note that if you'd like to find out more about those groups that are hosting here and what kinds of things we're doing, we would love to hear from you. And thank you. And now we will go to Lori for a moment here.
Yes, thank you, Rhonda, and thank you to all our presenters. I just wanted to mention that we're very fortunate to have Delegate Jared Solomon from Montgomery County District 18 joining us tonight, and Carrie DeSantis, who's here for Delegate Valentino Smith, District 23A, Prince George's County. So welcome, thank you. I invite you, if you had a word you wanted to say. If not, we'll turn to questions.
Lori, I'm just happy to say hello, and sorry I'm not on camera. I just put our little guy to bed a couple of minutes ago. But I just wanted to thank you all. I've worked with many of you on the call on other environmental bills, and I think some of you were on the Future of Rail town hall that Congressman Brown and I hosted about 2 weeks ago, and I saw it in the chat, and I know it's been mentioned a couple of times today. I mean, to me, we have a MARC rail system that, you know, obviously is already built, benefits the communities, you know, all along the corridor between Baltimore and DC. And, you know, if we're able to make the upgrades to the BMP tunnel, which we know Amtrak and MDOT and the federal government are really working actively towards, you know, we could get to a place where the time it takes to get from you know, an upgraded Penn Station in Baltimore to a Union Station in, hopefully an upgraded Union Station in Washington could be as little as 30 minutes or less for express trains. And so, you know, instead of creating a brand new shiny object, let's do a little bit of polish on the system we already have, and let's all get behind, you know, MARC investments. We have, you know, Amtrak Joe, a president in the White House who's probably more supportive of rail than any president, you know, in the last 50 or 60 years. And, you know, we have a system that, again, already benefits the communities along the way and just needs a little bit of an upgrade and a shove in the right direction. So thanks for all your activism, and look forward to working with you to advocate for good improvements to rail, not ones that are going to destroy communities along the way. So thanks again, Lori, for the invitation.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, and doing it at bedtime, no less. Thank you. Hi, Carrie. Did you want to say anything for Delegate Valentina Smith?
Yeah, she wanted to be here tonight, and she's very, we've been following this issue very closely, and she is very concerned about the Purple Line as a cautionary tale for sure, and the private funding aspect of this. So, and not to mention, of course, the environmental impact and all the points that everybody touched on tonight. So I will report back to her, and thank you very much. I thought the presentation was great. And if you do email it to everybody, that would be wonderful, because if she can review the slides.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and please thank the delegate as well on our behalf. So I think now we can turn to questions. There are some that have come in on the chat, and some of them I've seen responses in the chat as well, but I thought maybe we could just loop back and touch on these questions. So one from Fran, have geostability issues been researched? She says, I believe, for example, they are tunneling under Colmar Manor Park, which is an old landfill next to the Anacostia. She doesn't know if this increases problems or not. Did one of the speakers want to address that question? I think someone already did in the chat.
Yeah, certainly that was an important issue. I know that there was a lot of comment on the idea of going under a going through a landfill, but I'm not the person that was addressing that issue.
One of the major concerns of that particular landfill is it is believed, and in fact, it's pretty well understood, that it's contaminated, and the contamination has actually started to leach out of that landfill. So what raises the question is, as you bore under this and you remove the spoils, there's a whole series of issues that come up with. During the boring process, you're going to have to use a lot of water. Water will wash contaminants out of the soils. What happens to that water? How do you contain that, and how do you treat that? The soil itself has to be treated to remove the contaminants. And then you have these issues of where you're going to then dump the soil, okay, that's supposedly been decontaminated. And what do you do with the contaminants that you've pulled out of the soil? How do you dispose of them in an appropriate way? Okay. You also, as I said, have the water that was used during the boring process. That's got to be somehow collected. The big concern is that all this stuff somehow starts leaching away from your containment and gets into the soil and gets into the communities, et cetera. You can end up bringing contaminants and carrying them actually in through the communities. So yeah, there's a major issue, and the DES is pretty silent on how any of that's going to be dealt with.
I agree with Dan. I'll make one quick addition to that. Tunnels leak a little bit. So during operations, the wastewater from this landfill or any other along the tunnel will drip into the tunnel and be pumped out. And at the tunnel entrance, currently planned in Greenbelt, they have a whole wastewater sort of artificial wetland that would replace our natural wetland there. That's a wetland of special state concern. So there are a lot of issues related to this.
There's also a series of dredge ponds on the edge of Colmer Manor Park that have been a concern of mine for 20 years, and I've tried to get data. But those are dredge droppings from dredging the polluted base layer of the Anacostia River. It was never really properly remediated. So that's an additional source of contamination in addition to what's ever in the landfill. And I just don't think, I mean, I know no one's looking at it because I've been trying to get data on that for 20 years without any success. So pretty sure it's pretty hard to find. So these are just, this is just like the one area I know that I know is dirty and moderately contained, and I'm confident it will be made worse dramatically by the situation, impeding efforts to make the Anacostia fishable and swimmable.
Fran, you're absolutely correct, because one of the discussions that we were involved with from years ago with BWRR and presentations is they were going to take a lot of this dredging and build up some of the islands that are in the upper part of the Chesapeake Bay and some of the river areas. And we're saying, wait, time out. If it's contaminated, you're now going to dump all this contamination into our waterways. At the very same time, we're spending fortune trying to clean them up. That's not going to work. We're not even on the same page here. We're not even in the same universe here. Okay.
And if I could chime in, Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission had a full analysis of the DEIS and found it insufficient in addressing these kind of issues. I know exactly where you're talking about, and that tunnel is going to go right underneath that dredge pond. And there's, with the leaking and the seepage already, it's a huge problem. But that's what we're finding out. The DEIS is not addressing these issues sufficiently.
Right.
Maryland National Park and Planning pointed this out. All the other entities that are analyzing the DEIS, MCRT is requesting that a new draft environmental impact statement, supplemental one, be provided that will address all the issues that we're finding insufficient.
Just to give you all a heads up, we're in the final throes of putting our comments together. We will be hundreds of pages when it's done.
Now, this is outside my knowledge, but it might be necessary for someone to sue FRAA and for a judge to determine that a supplemental DEIS is needed. I'm not sure that the FRA will just voluntarily do one of those.
Larry isn't on the call, but we do have a lawyer that's involved, with the.
These are very early on, so we'll wait and see how the FRA responds. But yes, there are potential actions that can be brought to encourage them to actually follow the NEPA process and pay not more than lip service to some of the requirements that they seem to have just kind of glossed over.
And the reason that we're submitting hundreds of pages is because there's so many things that were not addressed in this DEIS, because the more we got into it, the more we saw was not addressed. So that's why we're going to request they do another environmental impact statement, because so much was not addressed, and we're hitting them with everything that we know, because we have a lot of experts on the MCRT that has delved into this and put a lot of time and effort into this. So we found a lot of holes in it.
So we have another question.
All volunteer, I would like to add. No one is getting paid. They've spent an inordinate amount of time going through 4,100 pages of this DES and a ton of other material. Okay.
So we have another question that was brought up from David Blockstein, who asked, what is the process once the DEIS comments are received? What are the decision points and who are the decision makers?
The principal decision maker for the next step is going to be the FRA. They're going to review all the comments, compile them, and then make a decision on whether to request more information, i.e. a supplemental or some other kind of DEIS response. Then some of the decision points are ask for more information or get more information and release it for public review and comment. The second one is that if it is sufficient response they've received, that they will decide they don't want to go forward with the project. The most likely action they would take is to suspend the project. And what that basically does is it kind of effectively kills it, but it doesn't make it go away entirely. You know, this corpse could rise again, okay? Or the last action, which is, and that is the no build option. They could say that it's just not worth the cost and we're not going to pursue this.
Another part of this is that we're asking to make sure in what's being submitted is we're asking to make sure that the FRA issues or develops rules of particular applicability, as I mentioned in my talk, for the safety of the maglev, because that's the one, I mean, that's one of the important things that they've overlooked in the DEIS is really important safety issues. And they talked about putting them off until after construction starts, which just seemed totally illogical. So that's one of the points we've made in our submittal.
We have
So
another.
Wallace was very good in informing us in sharing his expertise is if construction starts and then the FRA comes back and say, hey, we don't think this particular piece of the construction is really meet the kind of safety standards that we would want to have here in our country. Their response can say, well, it's too late. We've already started construction and, you know, we can't go tearing this all out and redoing it. Okay. So we could end up not having or having a system that does not comply with the kind of safety rules and regulations that other systems like Amtrak and others that must comply. Yeah.
We have a question related to Amtrak. Rob Fox brought in. It relates to Amtrak, its plans, how it can increase the speeds, right-of-way issues. Will that decrease the trip costs, or what would be the impact there?
Well, first off, go ahead.
Yeah,
First off,
there's
the
a number of
Amtrak.
areas.
Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you. There are a number of issues here. One, Amtrak is already developing their next generation Acela. They've actually built it right up in upper state New York, and it's in Colorado right now, and they're going final approval and testing. They plan to deploy that in 2022. Second, as Suzzie talked about, there's already high-speed rail that's been installed. Basically, all the rail systems that come out of Baltimore into DC are now high-speed continuous rail. I know this because I rode MARC for almost 30 years, and I was there when they were doing all these upgrades, okay? MARC itself, equipment can run at over 100 miles an hour and often does when they express out of Washington into Odenton. There is a West Baltimore project that, again, the DES doesn't talk about any of this stuff, that the proposal is pretty straightforward. Using existing rail and existing MARC equipment, you can express from West Baltimore and be in DC with a stop at BWI Airport in 29 minutes, and it'll cost you $8 one way, versus doing it in 15 minutes, 14 minutes shorter, and it costs you $60 to $80. Okay, so it's quite a big difference. And Amtrak, MARC, VRE, all these systems integrate very, very well with Metro, with the subway, with light rail, with other kinds of ground-based transportation systems. They purposely have done that. SCMagLev is basically an independent system that integrates with virtually nothing. So you have additional travel time and commute time to get to your destination or get to the station where, because, and like I said, since the SCMagLev station's in the southern tip of Baltimore and Cherry Hill, it's almost right on the border with Anne Arundel County. There's a 10-minute plus trip just to come from Camden Yards, or 15 plus minutes to come from downtown Baltimore, where Amtrak and MARC have stops at Penn Station, at Camden Yards, and in West Baltimore, all of them downtown Baltimore.
So there was a comment in the chat, and I'm sorry if I'm putting him on the spot, but I'm wondering whether Delegate Solomon can speak to the relationship in the approval process between Maryland DOT, Federal Railroad Administration, and those approvals. Can you say anything about the role that MDOT plays here?
Yeah, Lori, that's a good question, and I am not the expert on that, to be honest with you. My knowledge, what I think that that MDOT is going to have to give some sort of approval at some point. We had Holly Arnold with us from MTA, and they were very opaque and sort of non-committal in their role in the process, more that they're just sort of, they're in discussions. I do think they will have to approve. My sense would be, and I don't know the specifics of every parcel of this project, that there may be something that the Board of Public Works would ultimately have to approve. My sense is that obviously if we have a governor and a transportation department that is not in favor of this, that makes a huge difference. And so obviously, that lends a lot of importance to the next general election. Not to get political, but same conversation many of us have had around the Beltway issue. If you have a governor that is pursuing other transportation alternatives and chooses to divert the resources of MDOT elsewhere, that sends a major signal to any major developer or private entity that might want to come in and do something. And even though there obviously isn't an official sort of allocation from MDOT, to this project, MDOT has to expend time and resources to analyze the DEIS and approve permits and things that they're going to be asking for. So my sense is that there is some kind of a role for MDOT to play in this. I'm just not 100% certain.
There was a question that asked about some of the environmental groups and coordination, and I wonder, Owen, could you have some input or Sam in what kinds of collaborations they're planning?
Sam, do you want to try that?
I'm going to punt to Stephanie. Is she still on here? I think she was.
I could chime in about that. We have provided briefings to the environmental groups. We are working with the National Parks and Conservation Association, and we've briefed all the river keepers and environmental groups, and they have agreed to work with us. There's going to be a specific DEIS letter for them to sign to oppose this project. And also it came up in the chat, and I'll just remind everybody, when you're writing your comments to oppose this project, state very clearly that you support the no-build option. The no-build option. And that is very important for the comment process. But yes, we're working very closely with the environmental groups.
There was another question, this may be for Michael, and it has to do with whether or not the DEIS considers the impact on potentially displacing low-income residents in Cherry Hill due to potential increased land values at the station area. Do you know anything about the impacts to the Cherry Hill neighborhood?
Okay. No, unfortunately, I do not. Cherry Hill, being out of Baltimore and me being closer to DC and PG County, I'm not that familiar. I don't know if I know Dan is in the Baltimore area. Do you know anything about Cherry Hill?
I live not that far from it. Anne Arundel County. I live in Linthicum, which is the first community as you cross out of Baltimore into Anne Arundel County. And I commuted when I lived in Baltimore and commuted through Baltimore and literally went past Cherry Hill every day going to high school. Cherry Hill, for those of you who may not know, is a relatively, and has been for a long time, a relatively low income, poor community. And yes, that's one of the major concerns that's has been brought up, is that if this thing should get built, and if they start developing in that area, it is very likely that large numbers of people will be displaced. You know, they'll basically be priced out of the area or bought out and told to go someplace else. That is a real possibility.
So I think the question was, does the impact statement quantify this?
No,
And I pulled up chapter 4.5, which talks about environmental justice. And Cherry Hill is mentioned 11 times. And just a quick look at it, they're generally saying this will be great. There'll be investment and they'll tear down the old buildings and build new ones. And then I found one little statement that says the low income populations might be displaced. So as usual with the DEIS, they start to get it halfway right, but they put a weird emphasis on it.
Yeah, but more, let's put it this way. They will be displaced. They're not going to be building new buildings because that's where they're going to be putting the station. So there isn't any other, there isn't a lot of areas to build there because everything's basically been built there. So they will be displacing a lot of low income people.
There's another issue I'd like to bring up that we didn't talk about much. That is actually the company says there will not be any eminent domain issues about taking away houses, but it's a little more complicated than that. And I think, Pat, it was either you or Susan who said that the tunnels would go under their house, and then what happens I'm sorry. Okay.
correct.
Correct. And what happens then is that the company would, you'd have to sign something, because in fact, what's above your head does not belong to you. What's below your property does belong to you. And so they would need to have a waiver if they want to build a tunnel under your property. If you would have to sign the waiver or maybe get a little bit of money up front is the way they often do it. But if you don't want to sign the waiver, this gets complicated. If you're in the middle of the tunnel, you might end up having to deal with eminent domain. But this is a real iffy situation. We don't really know how that works. And the other one we brought up only slightly in through Mike talked about is the fact that the tunnels would go under property and they will have an impact. But you have very old properties in some of these areas, and you have large apartment buildings and other buildings that really they have structural problems already. So that's another piece that would be good to have some more information about.
The problem is that especially in Linthicum and all, it's going to be going under or near historical areas with stone, masonry, cinder block, and the vibrations just from doing the tunneling can crack the foundations, and then you have water leaking in, so it can cause a lot of problems. And they're going to be going through our historical area. So it's going to go within 300 feet of our elementary school, Linthicum Elementary. It's going to go adjacent to Lindale Middle School. And then we have houses here. It's going to go close to built between 1900 and 1930. So, you know, it's going to be a real problem.
I'm going to say, as you can see, there are a lot of issues and we hardly even touch the surface in this discussion. So are there more questions? I mean, we could stay on a little longer, but it's also past our time. So you're free to end the meeting or to ask a few more questions if you like. And Lori, did you want to?
Yeah, so I would just say, you know, this is an ongoing conversation. We'll make sure that all participants get the slides. We've recorded the session this evening. So I just want to thank everyone, the speakers, the panelists, participants, the delegates that joined us. Thank you so much. It's been extremely informative, and I hope this motivates people to go and sit down tomorrow morning and write their comments on the DEIS and get those submitted by May 24th.
And also, I didn't mention, you also might want to write your legislators because they're all involved, including your federal representatives. So, and they are listening to these things because it's really at the end, I think it'll be the federal government that makes the decisions, and they need some push from those people that that are part of the government across the country. So
Well, what they can do is go on mcrt.org, and we have letters there that they can just download, and they can put any comments in that they want, and then they can send them in if they don't want to, you know, write a letter. We already have letters on our website.
okay.
Great.
And thank you to the speakers. I want to thank everybody personally for being so knowledgeable and also good sports about doing these 3 to 5 minute presentations. It's hard. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.